I am a Yank in Sussex. About 10 miles northeast of Eastbourne, in East Sussex, are two very interesting structures, just 100 yards apart in distance, yet centuries apart in time. These are the castle and observatory at Herstmonceaux. The castle was built in 1441 by the then treasurer of the household for King Henry VI, Sir Roger Fienne. He was a descendant of the de Monceaux family, who had owned the original manor since the 12th century. The observatory was a rather later addition to the site, being constructed to house the Royal Greenwich Observatory in 1957. The tenancy of the original manor, which predated the castle, was granted by William the Conqueror to a man named Wilbert around the time of the Conquest, which was documented in 1086 in the Domesday Book. Presumably Wilbert's descendant, the Norman nobleman Engelram de Monceaux, was recorded as being married to the noble lady Idonia de Hurst sometime by the end of the 12th century. This led to the manor being called by the portmanteau Herstmonceaux, a name which also ended up being attached to the local village. So we were visiting Herstmonceaux Castle the other day. What did you think of the castle?
It was very attractive brick castle with half a moat round it.
Just half?
Yeah, there was only half. Half of it was filled and half of it wasn't. But no, it was lovely. And they've used it as a university now, and I wished I was a college student there. And then I could roam around and pretend I lived there, couldn't I? Yes. And I had a lot of old trees in the grounds as well, and that was very nice.
One of the descendants of Engelram and Idonia de Monceaux was the aforementioned Sir Roger Fienne, whose armour may or may not have looked like this. As the king's treasurer, he was quite an important person, so naturally he needed an impressive residence. So it was that he asked for and got permission from the king to build himself a castle on the site of the family's manor house. The castle now consists of an interior courtyard surrounded by living and working structure, as you can see from the aerial views, but originally the interior courtyard was mostly solid with rooms. The castle was not built to be defensible, but was instead more of a palace, and was in fact one of the first brick castles in England. It remains one of the best examples of such castles to this day. It was on a somewhat chilly but tolerable mid-March day that the British bride and I came to visit Herstmonceaux after an overnight stay in Eastbourne, in East Sussex. I had never been to Eastbourne before, and found it to be a very lovely town. In the evening, before bed, we took a walk on the waterfront and listened to the waves crashing on the shore just a couple of blocks from our hotel. I didn't have any firm plans for the next day, and the hotel stay was one of my Christmas presents. However, as soon as I saw that there was an observatory right next to a castle, what else could I do but go have a look? What's not to like about castles and observatories, after all? One of my online nicknames is Stargazer, so there was no hesitation. The castle and observatory at Herstmonceaux are just 10 road miles from Eastbourne, most of which passes through some extremely flat countryside. By oversight, I didn't get any video footage of the drive, but you can perhaps imagine how a former tidal bay now filled in with soil might appear. 1,000 years ago, the way we took would have needed a boat. Here's what the route map would have looked like around the time of the Roman invasion, about 1,700 years ago, when Pevensey Bay would have been an actual bay instead of just the place name of a village built upon longshore drift. The red dot at about mid-route represents a Roman-era fortification built around 300 AD, called by them Andaritem. It was then on a peninsula surrounded on three sides by water. There's a lot more to say about this fortification and castle, but I won't talk about it here. Look forward to a later video on what is today called Pevensey Castle. The British bride and I showed up at Herstmonceaux Castle on a Monday afternoon, and we were able to sign up for the last guided tour of the day. Now, normally we don't care to go on guided tours of anything, because we prefer to guide ourselves. But because the castle is privately owned, this freedom to wander doesn't exist. In fact, the castle is a working campus of Queen's University of Toronto, Canada, and there are classes and conferences taking place at any given day. Random visitors wandering into classrooms and meetings is just not done. I tried to record the guide's voice, and while it did work well enough to be able to take notes from, I don't think that you really want to listen to an hour's worth of information, because that's how long the tour took. I'm just going to cover some of the most important points while showing you some of the video footage that I got of the castle's interior. Our tour guide's name was Victoria, and she averred to us that this was in fact her first time giving a tour on the property and hoped that we would go easy on her. I didn't think much about it at the time because generally I'm pretty easygoing anyway, but if she hadn't confessed to her tyro status, I would never have figured it out. Information flowed freely from her to us tour members like water from a spring. I was amazed at her knowledge. Some of what follows were things that she told us, and some I got from other sources, but it's pretty much all of a piece. So we were told that just before the conquest, the settlement in the area was reckoned to be worth £6. Although, of course, in those days, the worth of the property didn't mean what you would have to pay for it if you wanted to buy it, but how much money it could generate in economic activity per year. £6 isn't currency or legal tender. It actually means £6 of silver. Now, what does this mean in terms of what we would call real money? It's hard to figure, but if you go by buying power, or what you could buy for the money, one source I consulted said that it could mean up to £2 million in current British pounds. That's not bad. Because of the conquest, however, and keep in mind that this part of the country was suffering directly from the pillaging by the Normans, the productivity of the manor dropped to £1, or £385,000 in current money. But by the time of the Domesday Book in 1086, its value had recovered and gone up to £10, or 3.8 million current pounds per year. As I mentioned earlier, the manor here was granted to a man named Wilfred, probably of the de Monceaux family, but in 1330 the last male de Monceaux died and ownership passed to an heir of a female line with the name Fienne, named Roger, who was a knight and a supporter of King Henry V. Both Sir Roger and his brother James fought at the Battle of Agincourt in 1415. It was Sir Roger who built the castle. Sir Roger's son Richard inherited the manor and the castle, and because of his marriage to Joan Dacre, a daughter of the Baron Dacre, he acquired that title by right of marriage, because the Baron had no sons, making him the 7th Baron Dacre. This title then descended to their descendants until their grandson Thomas Fienne, the 9th Baron Dacre, when that lordling got caught up in a murder scandal at the time of King Henry VIII. Henry didn't take kindly to the shenanigans in question, so Thomas got hung, and his titles were forfeited. Not to worry, though. Later, Queen Elizabeth I restored the titles to Thomas' son Gregory in 1558, who became the 10th Baron Dacre. Now, I have a tendency to get all caught up in inheritances, titles, forfeits, and estates. As a genealogy hobbyist, I find it all very fascinating. But I'm not going to indulge myself any further along this vein. Yes, thank me later. So I shall suffice it all to say that the castle, which is the subject of the video after all and not the nobles who squabbled over it, left the ownership of the Dacre barons when the 15th Baron Dacre sold it in 1708 to a Mr. George Naylor. Why did he do this? Because one of his favorite pursuits was gambling, but he wasn't very good at it, and he ended up in a tremendous amount of debt. Well, the castle remained with the Naylors, but not in its original condition, because in 1777, when it came under the ownership of Robert Hare Naylor, his wife, Henrietta Henkel, didn't want to live in a drafty old castle without any modern conveniences, or at least those conveniences they had 250 years ago. So she consulted the famous architect Samuel Wyatt, and he came up with two proposals. The first was to restore the castle with new modern features, which would cost a lot of money, or use the castle's bricks to build a brand new manor house nearby that would be much more comfortable than any old castle. Mrs. Naylor managed to convince her husband to go along with the second proposal. Actually, the source I found says she nagged him until he went along with it. So Mr. Wyatt reduced the castle to a picturesque ruin by demolishing the interior brickwork, leaving only the external walls standing. Here's a picture. Isn't it a lovely, picturesque ruin? Makes me shudder. And so the castle stood in ruins until the 20th century, when restoration work was undertaken by Colonel Claude Lowther in 1913. It took 20 years to accomplish, but it was finally completed in 1933. The existing interiors largely date to this period, incorporating architectural antiques from England and France. The one major change in planning was the combination of the 4 internal courtyards to one large one, which I alluded to earlier. In 1992, the castle came onto the market again, and Alfred Bader, an alumnus of Queen's University, Ontario, Canada, learned about it while traveling through England, and he offered to buy the castle for his wife. She declined, joking that there would be too many rooms to clean. He bought it anyway, but for his alma mater, Queen's University, and it soon became a campus of the university's Canadian University Study Abroad program, QSAP. It's been known as Bader International Study Center since 2009 in honor of Dr. Bader. All the renovation work uncovered a number of interesting details, 2 of which I'll mention here. The first is an oubliette. If you've not heard of this, another word for it is dungeon. And what self-respecting castle doesn't have one? An oubliette, or bottle dungeon, is a form of dungeon which is accessible only from a hatch or a hole called an angstloch, or worry hole, in a high ceiling. This is where the master of the castle would put you if you displeased him or her. The word oubliette comes from the French word oublier, meaning to forget, and suggests that once you get tossed into one, they'll just forget about you. And when I say tossed, I mean it exactly. If the jailer likes you, he might lower you into it with a rope, but if he doesn't, he'll just toss you in. Good luck keeping your bones intact in the fall. And if he likes you, he might even feed you, or in other words, toss some bread down the hole once in a while. Later, if they remember you, they might lower a rope and haul you back out. Or maybe not. This oubliette has an unusual feature, a pit latrine. Such luxury. The other feature is actually rather similar to the castle's oubliette in that it is underground, but it's actually part of the escape plan if the castle falls to an enemy. This escape hatch was unknown until the renovation in the 1990s, when it was discovered and found to be being used as an underground home by an old gentleman and his dog. The exact extent of the escape passage isn't known, so where it ended up, probably some distance away from the castle, is anyone's guess. There is so much more I could tell you about the castle, including the ghost that haunts a particular room, the various entertainments that went on there in times past, and so on, but time presses onward. If you want to know more, you'll have to visit the castle yourself. So, on to the observatory. This first dome in view is actually empty. It used to contain the 98-inch Isaac Newton telescope from 1967 to 1984, but that telescope has been relocated to the Canary Islands because of light pollution and the better weather found at those latitudes, and perhaps because the astronomers wanted to get a suntan. But before the white dome of the Isaac Newton telescope came the 6 green domes of Herstmonceaux. This observatory was built in 1957 as the Royal Greenwich Observatory, replacing the original Greenwich Observatory at Greenwich in London because light pollution from the city made observations there too problematic. The old Royal Observatory was actually at Greenwich since 1676, so moving its operations out into the Sussex countryside was quite a break from tradition. However, light pollution again became a problem even out in the Sussex countryside, and so in 1990 the Royal Greenwich Observatory was moved again to Cambridge this time. But following a decision of the Particle Physics and Astronomy Research Council, it closed in 1998, after 322 years of important and valuable service. Its most ancient function, data providing solutions to astronomical and celestial navigation problems, was continued by Her Majesty's Nautical Almanac Office, now based in Taunton in Somerset. The observatory at Herstmonceaux is now operated as an educational facility. It's called the Observatory Science Centre. The center is an interactive, hands-on facility which has been operating in the former home of the Royal Greenwich Observatory since 1995. The telescopes under the domes remain operational, and while they are not being used scientifically for research purposes, they are open to the public on the center's open evenings. These are usually held during the autumn, winter, and spring, with 1 or 2 exceptions. There are daily tours which are given by knowledgeable operators. or volunteers, and although, as I said, I usually avoid guided tours, it seemed that there might be technical information not necessarily made available in the exhibits, so I attended the tour. This turned out to be a great choice because I got the chance to see the dome of the 26-inch Thomson refractor opening and then rotating to put the business end of the telescope looking out the gap. I took some video footage of this event, which I have sped up a bit because it took a fair amount of time to accomplish. Here it is at about 6 times normal speed. Now this took about 3 minutes, and so I sped it up to 30 seconds. As you can see, it opening here. And we're going to have a close-up of one of the motors here in a second. There it is. And now it's going to be fully open, and he's going to move the dome around to where it's pointing out the gap. Okay, here we go. Pointing out the gap. This video is already long enough without going through a detailed recitation about all 6 of the telescopes at the observatory. I recommend a visit to the observatory itself, if you can, or its website for a full explanation. Link in the description. Here are the important points about each dome and the telescope lurking therein. Dome A contains the Thomson 30-inch reflector. It's 120 years old and is named for Sir Henry Thomson, a London surgeon and amateur astronomer who presented it to the observatory. For years, it was the largest telescope at Greenwich and was used to photograph comets, asteroids, and the satellites of outer planets. In 1908, this telescope was used to discover the 8th moon of Jupiter. Dome B contains the 36-inch Yap reflector. It was built in 1932 and was a gift from Mr. William Yap, who was a prominent industrialist. It replaced the Thomson 30-inch reflector as the largest at the observatory. Dome C contains the 34-inch Hewitt camera. It's specifically a camera because it was built specially for photography, not for looking through. This telescope was named after its designer, Joseph Hewitt, and was built in the 1950s for use in tracking Blue Streak, a British ballistic missile which was then under development. Afterwards, this telescope was used to track satellites, especially Soviet satellites during the Cold War. Dome D contains the 13-inch astrographic refractor. Like the telescope in Dome A, it is over 120 years old and was built specifically for the new technique of astronomical photography. It was used in a very ambitious 13-year program that began in 1892 that determined the precise positions of over 179,000 stars. Woo! It is also the telescope that was used to confirm one of the predictions of Einstein's general theory of relativity in 1919. Dome E contains the Thomson 26-inch refracting telescope. Like the telescope in Dome A, this telescope is named after Sir Henry Thomson and is also over 120 years old. This telescope is in the dome which the tour guide demonstrated the operation of the dome. It's the 12th largest refracting telescope in the world and the 2nd largest in Great Britain. The telescope's tube is so long that the telescope has to be mounted up high on the dome in order for it to be able to move properly, or freely rather. In order to safely gain access to the lower end of the telescope, this dome has a unique feature. The entire floor of the dome can be raised or lowered like a lift or elevator. Dome F contains the 38-inch Congo Schmidt camera. The camera was originally built to be installed at an observatory in the Belgian Congo, hence its name, but due to regional instability it was never delivered. In fact, it was sadly never used for astronomy in any case, since the mirror of this reflector was found to be imperfect. The dome it is installed in is open during the day, and it contains a fascinating set of displays about the history of astronomy and of the telescope itself. I'm just going to pan across the scene here. This is the observatory grounds outside. It contains a lot of very picturesque elements, including this element, which is called the Poor Man's Taj Mahal. And as you can see, there's a lot of exhibits out here for children and adults, explaining various scientific principles and things in connection with astronomy in particular. It's quite worthwhile showing up and having a look. Now, this used to be a working observatory, and at night things would be very dark. And so, as you can see here on the paths, what you have is different textures on the ground. rough, smooth, and grass. This was to help astronomers avoid falling off paths so they could find their way to the domes without ruining their night vision in the dark. What I'm going to do now is take you into Dome F, where the Congo-Schmidt camera is located, and show you the various things that are inside the dome, which are quite interesting in regard to astronomy and the Royal Observatory itself. This is extremely interesting, and if you didn't know anything about telescopes, which I actually do a little bit, you'd find this extremely educational, and you could hardly hold yourself back from reading every doggone thing in here. It's great. So I'm just going to go ahead and leave off commentary and just let this little clip go to the end here without any further ado. I'm going to transition over to the main building, which contains an enormous number of very sciencey kind of exhibits. Obviously, this is intended for children, but I'm sure adults could get a lot out of it too, because, as I said, it's extremely sciencey. Crystals and astronomy and various other things like that. This is an educational center, after all. And you'll note here that we have a little exhibit on the planets, including a dwarf planet, Pluto, which has been demoted, of course, as you know, from planet to dwarf planet. Sad event, sad event. Anyway, so this is a wonderful place to take kids to, especially kids who are curious about the world around them, and especially the world that they see in the skies at night. So, highly recommended. I'm going to go ahead and close out the video at this point with the exhibit near the entrance or the exit of the facility, and that is of the 98-inch mirror here, which was for the Isaac Newton telescope that was eventually moved to the Canary Islands. The display includes a little bit of information as to how it works and how it was made. And on the way out or on the way in, you find yourself with a little souvenir shop. Has a lot of really interesting sciencey type stuff to buy if you like. And there we're done. Now this has been a production of A Yank in Sussex. Please like and subscribe if you haven't already. And you have a nice day.